Okay, the concept behind Abject Tomorrow is basically it's a dystopian kind of fantasy set in the near future, where all humankind are required to have an implant in their brain that regulates their emotional state. And it tells the story of one man who awakens one day to discover that his implant has failed, and he begins to feel emotion and kind of react to the world around him differently. Okay, in The Sycophants, our protagonist is just, as I said, is beginning to awaken to the fact that the world is not what he thought it was. His implant has failed, and he's starting to feel emotions, and the world is different to him. He notices the kind of the beauty of the world, and so on and so forth. He begins to kind of look at everybody else around him and wonder, why they aren't seeing the same things, and so on. And he begins to kind of feel a sense of sorrow about the inevitable march that everybody has towards death, where they're not really living the life they would want to live, and so on and so forth. And the music is kind of written to reflect that. It's kind of bright and hopeful at the very beginning. And then towards the second half, in the instrumental section, it becomes a lot more dark and a lot more sort of aggressive. So it mirrors his sort of journey from, hope into sort of absolute kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Loss of hope. I can't think of a better word than that. As he realizes that his situation is hopeless and there's nothing he can do to change the way the world is. Okay, so Abject Tomorrow, the title track, is sort of the flip side of The Sycophants. It's told from the perspective of the people who sort of rule the way the world is right now. And it's a very, very dark song lyrically, where it sort of maps out what humanity's purpose is. We're little more than consumers and cattle to feed into this sort of corporate machine that's running everything. It gets a little bit into the sort of mind control aspect of everything, but that's left for a later song on the album. It's a very aggressive, sort of heavy song with a very dark lyrical message. Okay, so song 3, Downfall, is again swung back to the protagonist's point of view. He's alone, sort of wondering if the world has always been the way it is right now. If there's ever been anything different, and there's ever been, freedom of expression, and so on and so forth. He wonders, was there a time when that people were free to be the way they wanted to be, and free to pursue their own exploits, and so on. And during this kind of process, he starts to hear a voice, and he thinks it's an angel speaking to him. And he's enthralled by this voice, and it tells him of ancient civilizations that were, amazing artists and created fantastical things and all kinds of stuff like that. And as the song progresses, he begins to doubt that it's really happening. He thinks maybe it's a product of his implant failing, and that he's starting to descend into madness. And as he begins to doubt it, the voice leaves, which leaves him sort of left with a whole bunch of doubt about the whole situation. And that's mirrored towards the end of the song, where it gets a lot more dark again. It's another song that starts off quite hopeful, I think, and progresses into something a lot heavier and darker as it progresses. So Agenda is a song, again, that swings back to the perspective of the corporate sort of side of things. There's a bit of dialogue between the protagonist and them. And what's happening in the song lyrically is that they attempt to remotely reboot his implant. They've detected that there's something wrong. And they're trying to feed a whole bunch of data to control him into it. and it's not quite working. It's messing with his mind a bit more. So really, it's them talking about how perfect their system is and how nobody can escape it. Nobody can. It's not possible. Basically, this is the way the world is, and it's always going to be this way. And then the second verse sort of goes into the history about how this came to be, and it's basically sort of a situation where humans were seen to be their emotions were seen to be causing a lot of problems in the world. Wars are being fought, and people were basically losing the run of themselves, for want of a better way to put it. So it was seen as a way to sort of bring humanity, forward, in a unified kind of way. But obviously it had a more nefarious purpose to those who were in control. And I think towards the end of the song, you can kind of get that sense, that it's a whole lot more nefarious. If you hadn't already got that from the song Abject Tomorrow, you definitely will get it from this one. It's a very, very heavy song. It's very influenced by a lot of the kind of more dark sides of metal, like death metal, and there's a lot of Meshuggah influence in there and so on. Okay, the 11th Hour is the next song, and lyrically in this one, the protagonist is he wants to connect with that voice again because it made him feel so amazing. So he decides to go into a meditative state, and the first two verses are dealing with that sort of serenity and kind of comfort of being at one. He doesn't quite connect with it in this situation. And as the song goes on, in the second half of the where it starts to pick up in terms of heaviness, the corporate sort of agents have found him, and they've broken into his apartment, or I don't even know if it's an apartment in the story, but let's say they've broken into his apartment and they've arrested him, and they're going to take him to be reconditioned. So that's that one.
Very interesting.
The next song is the instrumental Psychedelic Torture Trip. This one, obviously there's no lyrics, it's been an instrumental, but it does have context in terms of the narrative of the story. As he's been taken away, he's injected with a pain-inducing psychedelic as sort of a punishment for daring to kind of stand up or to be different. Mm-hmm. So he's going through this horrific pain, and the music sort of reflects that. And I kind of wrote that piece of music to sort of capture the essence of what it felt like to have a panic attack. And if you've ever had a panic attack, it can be very sort of jarring and jittery experience, and you can't quite grab onto anything. And the music really reflects that. It's kind of, there's things happening non-stop, and it's changing and chopping all over the place. So in terms of the story, that's where it leads to. It's him going through this horrific experience, where his mind has been bended in all kinds of different directions while being in physical pain, which doesn't sound very pleasant at all. Gods of the New Age is the next song, and after the instrumental, musically I wanted to have something much more straight ahead, with just a really heavy riff that you could sort of headbang to and pound your fist or whatever, and that's kind of what came out for that one. It was very deliberate in terms of the flow of the album. Lyrically, it's sort of an interrogation scene where he's been taken away to a cell and he's been told that basically you are faulty and we can fix you. It's sort of a fake sort of sense of comfort he has from this, that he's going to fall in line and go back to the sort of mechanized way he used to be. So he does his best to try and convince the people that what he's seen is amazing, and that everyone should experience it. But obviously they're not really open to that idea. They think it's a terrible idea, and that there's no way that humanity are going to be allowed to go back to that state of being again. So he's sort of told in no uncertain terms, you're going to be taken to be reconditioned, we're going to fix your implant and you're going to fall back in line.
Falls around
Okay, and the final song on the album is Analog Spectra, and it's an interesting song because it ended up being the longest one on the album. It's about 18.5 minutes long, and I suppose it can't be a prog album without an epic song on it. Well, so I believe anyway. But this song was never meant to be that long, to be honest. It just sort of ended up that way. The ideas kept coming, so I kept on writing. And lyrically, it's in 6 sort of sections, I suppose, where you have the first section where he's strapped into this machine and hooked up to their server to have, you know, his implant reconditioned and so on. And in the process of doing that, he's reflecting on his life and, you know, like what could have been and so on and so forth. That kind of, again, that sort of yearning for something better. And the second section is an instrumental part. And that is when the data has been flooded into his mind. And again, it's similar enough to Psychedelic Torture Trip in that where it's sort of panicky and, you know, flits around the place and complex and that kind of thing. The third section is essentially a death scene where he doesn't survive the process. It goes horribly wrong and he dies physically. But his soul or his mind or whatever you want to call it escapes into their machine. So as he dies, they broadcast what he has seen to everybody, because that's what they do. They control, you know, everybody with this sort of daily broadcast. So his mind or his essence gets sent out to everybody in the world. And then it leads on to the next part, which is a very, very heavy section again, where they're trying to shut down the machine, trying to stop him, you know, or stop his idea getting out. And then there's a final chorus, when you've heard the song, you'll kind of get where that is, but where he's talking about, he's calling on people to hear what he's said, live authentically and choose the way they want to be, rather than have this sort of control grid forced upon them. And then the final part is just sort of me tying it together with my own commentary on, you know, how things are and, you know, how to, I suppose, live our own lives authentically. And, you know, I'm not trying to be too preachy about it or anything like that. That's definitely important. You know, it's only my own thoughts. And I think it mirrors my own journey, to be honest. You know, it's quite a personal album in that way. There's a lot of ways to look at the story. It can be just a simple story like it is. But for me, it was written with my, you know, it was written in mind with my own struggle towards, you know, being a musician and feeling, am I any good at this? You know, is there much point in putting it out? Because we all have those two voices in our heads that tells you, you know, don't do it, you're not good enough. That's sort of a controlling, you know, push you down type of voice. And you've got that hopeful thing that thinks maybe you can, maybe, you know, try it out and see what happens. And there's a funny thing I actually discovered last night, is that it's almost a religious story in one way. I'm not a religious person at all, and this definitely wasn't intended. But it's sort of a savior story about a guy who reaches an enlightened state and then sacrifices himself to get a great message out to everybody. It's kind of biblical, but definitely not intended. So that's the story of the album, and that's the story what the songs are about.